So good evening to everyone, or morning, depending on where you are watching this from. A bit more than a year ago, Dimitris Papanikolaou, Christina Gedgodait, and myself, we met in Oxford for a conference we organized, through which we launched the cultural analysis network that we had just set up under the title Rethinking Modern Greek Studies in the 21st Century. Now, the kind of energy that we and the participants in that event shared could not and should not, as we felt, be allowed to fade away with the COVID-19 pandemic that made such gatherings in physical form temporarily impossible. And so we came up with other ways to make that energy circulate and expand through this network. An energy that we feel is there in the field of modern Greek studies today, in its intersection with other fields, and could take exciting forms and directions that we want to experiment with through this network. So today we welcome you to the sixth webinar in a series of online roundtables that we have organized since the start of this academic year. And that in the diversity of topics they have broached and the speakers they hosted from several disciplines, I think gave us a pretty good glimpse of how Greece and its culture and politics can become part of global debates. Now, this sixth webinar has a special significance for us. Now, as most of you will know, this is the week that marks the celebration of the 200 years since the declaration of the Greek War of Independence, which is linked to the date of March 25th, 1821. So in this week, but also at the moment fraught with sociopolitical tensions in Greece and beyond, we want to have a discussion on the nation, the Greek nation particularly, though not only, with Stathis Gourgouris by revisiting his very well-known book from 1996, Dream Nation, Enlightenment, Colonization, and the Institution of Modern Greece, revisiting it from the dense now in which we stand. In this same event, we are also very happy to launch the new independent website of our network under the title Greek Studies Now. Now, although the network's material will also remain on the Torch website, where the network's events and blog have been posted so far, and for which we are very grateful, our new website, which is designed by Periklis Douvitsas, offers new material and possibilities that we will briefly present. Christina Gedgodaita and Periklis Douvitsas will present this right after our discussion with Stathis Gourgouris. Now, this network's website, our new website, was made possible thanks to an innovative initiatives grant by the Modern Greek Studies Association, to which we are very grateful. And we're also thankful to Torch, of course, once again, for its immense support, financial and organizational, and Ambarakaliti particularly, as well as our other partners, the Ekaterini Laskaridis Foundation, the Department of Modern Greek at the University of Amsterdam, and the Subfaculty of Byzantine and Modern Greek in Oxford. Now, the now in the name of our website, Greek Studies Now, is this porous, multivalent present from which we want to revisit past narratives and receive knowledge through present experiences, present debates or perspectives. It's also the now in which we are shaped as subjects, as scholars also, but also the now that we feel is fraught with the energy that we sense in our field, an energy that we would like to mine through this network by seeking exchanges that take us outside the comfort zones of our disciplines and bringing together young and more experienced scholars. And it is from this now also that today we want to revisit Stathis Gourgouris' book. And I very much look forward to this discussion as I give the word now to Dimitris Papanikolaou.
Thank you, Maria. Thank you, all of you who have been sending us comments, who have joined now from many countries, from Greece as well as the UK and the US. Different times, but also the same times in many ways. In the lengthy conversations that as members of this group we are having often, the words here and there but also the words Greece and Greek often return. Of course, they return. Greece as a rich history returns to our conversations, but it also returns as a difficult history, as a debate. It becomes an identitarian term, Greece, Greek, but also an open term, a term to be explored, to be critiqued, to be opened to new modes of thinking about citizenship and belonging. Greek studies now, therefore, as a project, rests exactly on this double epistemology. Greece seems as a settled historical territory to be studied, but also Greece being a platform from which and against which to raise questions that are constantly reframed now, as we speak, in the terms in which we decide to speak with, as well as in the ethical positionings that relate us to each and every one. Our network has been from the outset engaged with questions that we wanted to repeat today on 22nd of March 2021. What is the role of the nation in today's social and political landscape? What aspirations of social cohesion, equality, longevity, and prosperity are expressed through the nation as both a symbolic structure and an ongoing sociopolitical project? To what extent are these aspirations disrupted and undermined, always in the name of the nation? What projects of violence, erasure, and disavowal lie behind the national fantasy? How do they still haunt the national everyday? How does the nation still matter? Could it also matter differently? In the week celebrating the 200 years since the Greek War of Independence, we want to return to these questions in the frame of our Local Cases Global Debate series. Indeed, Greece has been a prime example of this, of a local case and a global debate, of a modern nation building process involved in the dynamics of enlightenment, ethnicity, crypto-colonialism and colonialism, orientalism, capital extractionism, and the North-South dialectic. Modern Greek studies as a field has been framed time and again as a response to such questions. In order to revisit this way of thinking, such questions, in this particular week of national celebration, but also of national rethinking, we could not think of a better person and a better starting text to invite than Professor Stathis Gourgouris and his book, Dream Nation, Enlightenment, Colonization, and the Institution of Modern Greece. Stathis is Professor of Classics and English and Comparative Literature at Columbia University in New York. Apart from Dream Nation, he's also the author of the very influential monographs, Does Literature Think?, Lessons in Secular Criticism, and most recently, The Perils of the One, as well as numerous essays and edited volumes and so on. An engaging but also engaged thinker, a public intellectual with a wide reach in his writing, a poet, an iconoclast, always an iconoclast in content, in style, in their in-between. What do I take from Dream Nation? That book that many of us have been revisiting last week in preparation for this event. It is a book that does not talk about how to do the nation, but on how to imagine it, how to dream it, how to return to that moment when the nation was dreamt. It is not a how to do the history of the nation, but a how to realize that this national history is bound to be unfinished, constantly rewritten, betrayed, and unachieved. And like all our dreams, a matter of attraction and repulsion, of reconstructing, constant reconstructing, and undoing. Published in the 1990s, and I hope Stathis will speak to that also, in a period of heightened nationalist feeling, especially in the Balkans. This was a monograph that I think many of us could say, well, that made us. A paradigm text, an important lesson on how to think and how to do modern Greek studies. So we invite Stathis Gourgouris today to open a discussion on the legacies and the contemporary relevance of his 1996 influential monograph. We're joined by colleagues in the field. Some of us are in the Zoom. I know that many others are on the live YouTube. We all want to reflect based and starting from Stathis' first points and his book. We want to reflect now, today, both on the national, post-national legacies of Hellas, but also on the changes in modern Greek studies since the first publication of Dream Nation. We are, of course, very mindful of the moment this discussion is being held, in all the political complexity, as well as the celebratory overtones currently experienced in Greece. And we aim to take this critically into account too. Dream Nation 200 years on, today's event will be followed in a month's time by What Greece, an open mic event on April 21st. And then a month later by We Have Never Been Racist, Rethinking Race and Ethnicity in Greece, which will happen on 17th of May. These webinars, all three, comprise our network's tripartite contribution to debates around the bicentennial of the 1821 Greek War of Independence. And we aim to engage as many scholars, but also artists, filmmakers, and authors in this discussion. But to come back to Dream Nation, Stathi, Dream Nation, 25 years after, but also 200 years on. Thank you for accepting our invitation. It's an honor, and the floor is yours for your first thoughts.
Thank you, Maria and Dimitri, I'm delighted to be part of your extraordinary project. That's the first thing I would have to say. And thank you twice, because of course it is an honor for me. It is an honor for any writer at any point to have his or her work discussed. Of course, for me, especially this book, because it's a very youthful work. According to this inventive title, I'm 200 years old or more. No, I'm quite seriously, I had a chance to reread the preface. I only read the preface just recently. So it did create certain thoughts that I had not expected. I don't want to take up too much time because I'd much rather have a conversation. I will just kind of restrict my remarks on sort of 3 points, maybe. Reading the first is probably a matter of method, or a question of method, because if anything, the book it is rather experimental in both in terms of its context and also in terms of what my development was at the time, which was in fact, as I said, very early, still rather forming. So I was struck in reading the preface that the word that is used more than any other is the word history. And I thought, well, that's very interesting. I'm not a historian, but no doubt in my mind, I was attempting to write a history, a kind of double history. One, the history of the nation as a form, its emergence and its formation in Europe, and all of the aspects that are linked to that, questions of modernity, of course, questions of all kinds of politics I'll get to in a minute, the question of capital and so on. But also at the same time, the history of Greece, of modern Greece, its institution, as I say in the title. So I should say, because some people might not know or not remember, that the context at the time, in terms of history, was particularly interesting. There had been some, groundbreaking works reflecting on what it means to write history. What does the writing of history mean? Figures like Hayden White or Michel de Certeau or Carlo Ginzburg. I think there's no doubt that this was certainly influential. But of course, as I said, I'm not trained as a historian. So the attempt to write a history of this kind was affected by a kind of literary studies sensibility, and which involves a certain attitude towards reading, and not just simply the reading of texts, because by the time that I began this work, I should say, some of this material began getting written around 1988. It's a long time ago. But already at the time, the idea of reading had expanded to not just simply textual reading, but reading of all aspects of life in the world, of all signs of life in the world, images, structures, modes of operation, and so on. So that's the first thing to say, and I would like to, I would enjoy hearing your people's views on this matter. It's the question of the emergence of the nation, the fact that the nation is a historical form. It is not, despite the metaphysics that, of course, it espouses and proliferates, passes on. And what does it mean for something to be created in history? Who creates it? How is it created? What its life might mean in relation to that point of creation? How itself, any historical form, how it itself sees that moment of emergence. All of this is really a part of the project. So in that respect, the book, though Greece is its focus, obviously, it concerns issues that go way, way beyond the history of Greece. Now, the second thing, the second two things are more kind of a matter of content, if that's the right word. It's been remarkable to me. I really don't know how to account for it, actually, still, how influential this book ended up being, and not just simply in Greek studies. One of the points I think that was particularly influential and has since been taken up and reconfigured and recalibrated, sometimes in fact very interesting ways, was this discussion about Philhellenism as again a kind of historical formation, not just simply a discourse, but a series of practices and attitudes and fantasies, quite real and quite actual. And this was not just an idea of mine, although definitely there's certain inventiveness in this. It was really supported by research. It had occurred to me that Philhellenism and Orientalism, in the way that Edward Said sort of famously unraveled in his book, were remarkably close, and they were in fact, if not the two sides of the same coin, because they were in fact the same kind of practice, including literally practiced by the same individuals. So while Orientalism, as we know, is a certain kind of configuration of the so-called East, according to certain kinds of assumptions and images, but as Said never failed to remind us, and one of the aspects of his reception in terms of this book is that this is just not heard, it's always misunderstood. As he never stopped reminding us, is that these conceptions of the East had more than anything to do with how the societies of the West configured themselves. So what is in fact demonstrable, it is a fact, it's not my idea by any means, is that certain nations and certain societies, such as Germany or Britain, particularly, but in many ways, most of the European societies needed Greece as a certain a set of images and discourses and fantasies, I repeat that word again, in order to constitute their modernity. This had incredible implications in the formation of modern Greece as a nation. And I say this because there is this tendency right now, as we're celebrating the bicentennial, to kind of reproduce this fantasy of Philhellenism as this great thing, literally the friends of Greece, the friends of Hellenism, and not at all go back and look at its sort of darker underside, its kind of orientalizing underside. This discussion, which I've called the colonization of the ideal, was linked to my studies at the time of how colonialism in Europe was essential in national formation. And I think that, of course, is kind of a no-brainer these days, but it was not that frequently discussed at the time, except in certain circles of post-colonial studies, which were just emerging. You keep that in mind. And I was very, fortunate to be, even as a graduate student, to be part of that, and in the midst of that, having peers from all kinds of countries all around the world. And suddenly, then the case of Greece and its national institution, its own history as a modern nation, wasn't exceptional or in any case unique, but it was part of a much larger formation of how Europe created itself in its own national sort of substructures on the basis of a certain kind of colonial imagination, in which Greece played a huge role, because the idealization of the ancients was really how it kind of colonized the meaning of what Greece is for Europeans, which as a result created this other kind of, what would be the word, of disenfranchising of the contemporary Greeks, or the modern Greeks of the era. All of this is I talk about in the book at length, but it's traceable in all kinds of works. Lord Byron, obviously, who in fact, he's one of the better ones, kind of more complex ones. But, all of the romantic poets and authors, statesmen, philologists, travelers, whole institutional machinery, classicists, of course, I must say that. In this respect, permit me a parenthesis, in terms of today, this discussion that I engaged back then so long ago, I think is very pertinent to the discussions that are going on in classics as a field right now, in terms of all of these aspects, issues of race and colonial structures and so on. So there's a lot to say about that. We can certainly pick that up later on. The third thing, again along the same lines, is this issue of what I call social fantasy. So the book, tries to understand the national formation, or the formation of national identity, beyond its typical aspects as were understood in the social sciences. Language, religion, history, state formation, all those things, economics. And it looked into what now is discussed very, very easily again as the psychosocial elements, certain elements in the formation of national identity that go beyond what are usually understood to be the reasons or behind identity. Hence the notion of the dream, and a kind of Freudian or Freud-derived understanding of dream work, and how that might be understood not at the level of the individual, but at the level of a certain kind of imagination, a certain kind of social imagination that, as I say, creates things. So, the question of how social fantasy might be making history is a crucial question that this book tries to address. How social fantasy might, in fact, be the force behind institutions institutions of power, institutions of authority, institutions of binding, social binding, and so on. In this respect, the question of national history as a certain kind of genre of writing. I mean, remember, history is written, so it is in that sense, has all of the aspects that literature does. It has certain genres, certain kinds of rhetoric. How national history as a genre developed in the 19th century by the great historians of all these nations. Konstantinos Paparigopoulos is of course the Greek historian, but but I discuss also Jules Michelet and von Ranke and so on, a whole bunch of others, my colleague. How does the rhetoric of national history, what constitutes a rhetoric of national history? How national history creates stories of continuity, of culture, oftentimes disregarding discontinuities that are essential to understanding how things happen in the world. And in our case, how the Paparigopoulos texts, I mean, they're sublime texts, how they created a continuity by inserting a medieval era that would have to then connect to the ancients and the ancient and the modern aspects of what is Greek. The medieval era being the Byzantine world, but I call it the medieval era because the paradigm is European. All European societies, all European nations created a continuous history where their own Middle Ages played this kind of role, and Paparigopoulos did the same. And the reason behind it was so that Greece could qualify with its own proper modernity. Because the biggest problem of Philhellenism and its discourse was the disregard of Greek modernity, and in favor of course, the ancient ideal. So the discourses and institutions and practices that were mobilized as a result of this colonization of the ideal produced a certain kind of social fantasy in Greece that is in fact different from others. That's the particularity of this particular of this specific national formation, but not its exceptionalism. Of course, I will resist that. The certain process of self-orientalization that still happening, in fact, is also what this book discusses. Among a lot of other things that I'm not getting to, including discussions of the Enlightenment and what the Greek Enlightenment meant, the failure of the Greek, a modern Greek state and its institutions to honor or further, or both honor and further the Enlightenment paradigm, that I think is really something that is not a Greek problem per se, but part of nationalism and its metaphysics, the anti-Enlightenment forces that national formation produces, and so on. So I will stop there. Just one thing, because Dimitris asked me when we had previous discussions about this, to say something about how I see this book today, which is actually very hard for me to answer easily. My first thoughts is that, rather sadly, not much has changed. The book is kind of prescient. I would never use the word prophetic, obviously, but it's prescient. But it's prescient not because I was smart about it, because the structures that I was investigating and exploring are ongoing, and the nation as a form has proved to be incredibly resilient and resistant to globalization, to all, to the way that to Marxist internationalism first, we would say, right, 19th century onward, and then today to globalization. That is because the nation form is in some ways able to coexist with various other forms that precede it, pre-capitalist forms, pre-national forms. And so that's one element. Not much has changed. The European Union is exercising a kind of I don't know how to call it, a kind of curtailed national imaginary. I mean, I wrote this piece about the Greece's relation to Europe, the European Economic Community was called, as it was called at the time, back in 1990. And I argued that this multinational formation, transnational formation, unfortunately stuck along a certain kind of nationalist paradigm, a certain kind of nationalist fantasy, promoting Europeanness. This obviously is connected to its own incapacity to deal with its colonial and imperial past. But it's curtailed because, of course, the EU remains primarily an economic institution, not a political one. And that, I think, is also one of its failures. And then there are certain failures in Greece itself. Since then, its incapacity to work out its relationship with Europe, its fraught relationship with European culture, seesawing between a kind of xenophilia and xenophobia, as I had argued back then. That's still going on. And also a certain kind of incapacity to come to terms with its own nationalism, even in those who claim to be liberal and modern and, I don't know, European and so on and so forth, which underneath has allowed certain reactionary notions of race and of people existing since time immemorial and so on and so forth to remain, and to the detriment, I think, of all kinds of venues that could have been opened in relation to citizenship and a certain kind of I don't know how I could it, sort of multicultural. I hate that word, but something like that. A certain kind of heterogeneous concept of being Greek. So I think I will stop here because I'd much rather answer your questions and engage in conversation. Thank you.
Stathi, if you allow me the first question, just to frame this a little bit, and then our colleagues, I'm sure, will jump in with comments and questions. Somehow, reading your book recently, but also thinking about Greece more broadly, I kept wondering, are we talking about Greece as a model nation? Is this the paradigm of nation building process, or a very peculiar story, or the exception? So you're muted.
Yeah, sorry about that. I don't have it. There's nothing model about any nation. I think that the presumption of being a model exists probably in every nation. It's this kind of exceptionalist element that seems to exist in every nation, and it is a delusion. It's delusions of grandeur. So there's nothing model about Greece. And there are particulars to Greece, like there are particulars in every case. And these always need to be studied in that context and with a certain kind of precision, if one can do it. Always keeping in mind that these particulars are part of larger formations and networks of meanings and so on. So I don't know what more I would say about it, but I would certainly resist any kind of exceptionalist, notion about Greece. Although the peculiarity, that could be a word that we can use without thinking exceptionally, the peculiarity of its relation to the ancient world and to the significance that the ancient world has had now globally for Western societies, but because of the domination of Western societies globally, is something that deserves a kind of separate reflection.
Okay, we have now our first comments lined up. I would suggest that we go first to Olga Dimitriou, then to Edward Mitchell, and then to Francesca Ciaccone. And let's try first to go one after the other, and then Stathi, you respond to those. Let's have this as a more open discussion. So Olga Dimitriou, if you would like to share your thoughts.
Yes, thank you, Stasi. I have two questions that are about the reading the book today, which is more or less what we ended up with in this discussion. And the first one was about Greece today. So in terms of, in a way, doing violence a little bit to reading the dream. I know you're talking about Freudian dreams and not good and bad dreams, but in terms of what you say about dream work as not being quite complete, not fully a discursive textual task, the nation cannot be fully written. And the imaginary community always exceeds the actual, if I'm simplifying very crudely here. But my question is, does this hold for nightmares? In a sense, does the dream have to be positively connoted? And the reason I ask this is to ask, is what we criticize here today in terms of what we see in Greece happening, is what we imagine as even worse to the violences that are already that we're already witnessing? And in that sense, what does this critical imaginary, in the sense of not being able to see the bottom of the pit, if you will, what does that critical imaginary do? And I have a second question. Shall I ask it now?
Yes, please.
Okay.
And then let's have a first collection of comments.
Yeah. So my second question is in a sense related, because it's about the significance of displacement and what we're seeing today. And I was really struck by something I remember reading from years back, but it sort of, it brought it back again. What you say about the Chifliks and the Lausanne Exchange and what it did in terms of creating a new order of development that wasn't just capitalist, but it was about, so it wasn't just about the economy and land relations, but it was about cultural shifts in this new order that came with this great displacement. So my question is there a lesson here for today's displacements and what they are doing in terms of neoliberalism, and what are the cultural shifts that we're seeing now?
The nation has a bad dream, not only as a good dream, and also the shifts in today's precarity. Could we have also comments by Edward Mitchell and Francesca Ciaccone? I know the next people who have also asked, but could we have these two, and then the Stathis response, and then we go to the next group. Thank you. So Mitchell, yep. You have to unmute yourself. Yep.
Thank you. Thank you, Stathi. Good to see you again, and Maria, Dimitri, Christina, the organizers of this. Thank you. I hope we can get to the sort of thrust of what Olga is saying and come to the present. I kind of want to step back into the past a little bit first, and perhaps into the abstract. The book is indeed prescient, as was said, and with respect to your modesty, Stathi, so are you. You were not only receptive to all what that was going on at the time, and really it was a kind of madness in a way, but you were prepared to write about it. And the writing in this book, going back to it again, is beautiful. It's remarkable. And I appreciate that at the beginning you said, I'm honored as a writer and not honored as a professor or honored as a scholar, or heaven help us, honored as a specialist, which is sort of the worst of all things. But yes, remarkable prescience and remarkable writing. You know, when I first got this announcement email, I thought that it was the 200th anniversary of the book, Dream Nation, which didn't bother me at all until I started to put it together later, which shows you how screwed up my sense of time is. And also, I think, gives you a reason for why I'm no longer an historian. I wanted to bounce off a couple of things Stathis said in terms of the, first of all, the importance of the colonial social imaginary to the formation of Europe, a key to his book, of course. But you know, I mean, I think we understand that as going far beyond a simple geographic or cultural us or them, insider, outsider kind of relationship. And into what Stathis said about social fantasy extending beyond the social sciences, of which he, you know, mentioned linguistics, economics, et cetera, et cetera. Isn't that, or would you say that that's really where modernity lies in this both ability and, of course, its actual historical success in categorization, economics, psychology, language, whatever, what have you. The stuff that goes into card catalogs of libraries and the stuff that ends up in libraries. That's really, you know, in a sense, both the essence of modernity and the essence of Orientalism. I don't know if Said would agree with that, but I think in a way he would. And in that sense, is the nation state, I mean, of course, it's critical to the formation that we call modernity, again, as a kind of discrete category, one of its strangest features that we do that with it. But would you also say that the nation is subservient to the demands of modernity? The coming into being of the nation is subservient to those demands in the way we talk about, or used to talk about, X or Y being necessary to the demands of capital.
So if I understand you well, is the nation that makes modernity, or modernity that makes the nation, or in the end, is it impossible to answer this question? But of course, this was a great question. Can I have Francesca Ciaccone as well? Sorry to put all this.
These are very heady matters, but please go ahead.
Yes, exactly. Francesca.
Yes, good evening. Thank you very much, Dimitris, Maria, and Christina. And of course, thank you, Stathis, for this meeting that helps us think even in imprisonment. Mine is more an observation than a question, and I will try to be as quick as possible, but really rereading the book in preparation for today's meeting helped me connect the dots between something I have been observing happening in Greece right now, but I hadn't really made up, wrap my mind around it yet. And it really has to do with the fact that the book still perfectly stands even today. I'm talking about two let's call them political or social, I don't know, phenomenon. The first is the arrival of Me Too in Greece this year, and all of this, final outburst of rage from, a feminist point of view, but also its appropriation from the government and its patronizing way of dealing with the thing, a kind of protection, if you wish. And the second thing I observed is the violence we are witnessing that's happening in these days on the streets. And so I will say now why leafing through the book helped me connect the dots, because I saw these two things as, from one side, protection, like of the woman, and on the other side, a display of complete control in the public sphere. Let's say somehow a reflection of the old code of honor, just yet another way of self-colonization. It's not my idea, of course, it's it's been said in a parallel field, in anthropology. And so how is it possible that a thought that was influential in Greece in like the 60s, it's still valid today? I mean, that we can see it so extremely today. And well, rereading the book helped me understand why. It's because not only, as you said, the structure of the nation doesn't change and it's the same, and nation are still the poles we have to work with, but also because, just as any kind of construction, also the construction of citizens needs continuous reiteration. And this reiteration happens with exactly the same text you quote in the book, like the same exact thing you describe doesn't just happen in the period you talk about, but every year in textbooks. Exactly the same interpretation, never changes. So school books, that's why. So that's all. That was my observation. Thank you very much for reminding me.
Stathi, from modernity and bad dreams to immigration, social protectionism, Me Too, and school books.
Yes.
You've got it there. And then there are many other commentators. So
I'll try to be as brief as I can. Although these are very serious comments and questions. They deserve. I think Olga's point to remind us that dreams are of the danger of sort of abstracting the concept of dream. No doubt, the national dream is a nightmare for the national dream may work for some people and is a nightmare for others. That's always the case. Always the case. The national fantasy itself can become very easily a nightmare on its own. The great example, of course, is the great example that's contemporary to the book is the disintegration of Yugoslavia. It's very interesting that this book had incredible resonance in ex-Yugoslavia in all of its subsequent disintegrated forms. When the Serbian translation was done, which was done fairly early, before the Greek one. So it's interesting that they felt they understood the book and felt more connected to the book than people in Greece did. I need to say that it needs to be on the record. The Lausanne Exchange business is a perfect illustration. Let's not forget, it's a perfect illustration, first of all, of colonial politics. It was a British invention. It was the first gesture of partition that the British Empire was, in fact, would go on to promulgate everywhere it had the chance. Israel, Palestine is the other one. Of course, India and Pakistan, the most famous one. The Cyprus situation later on is also that. Partition is really the key to how colonial power handles and shepherds national formation. in order to allow national formation to emerge within territories of influence, in order to deal with national independence movements, it has to create these kinds of homogeneous populations. So the exchange of population in this particular case, it's really a partition of population, and in favor of both national formations, both Greek and Turkish, and it's a British invention. And I want you to think of it exactly in the context of all the others I mentioned. Its ills today are still felt, and they are similar to the ills that are felt in all those other societies that I mentioned. So yes, I think the national fantasy does not produce a homogeneous subject, and it's true that in Dream Nation a lot of times I don't get that down perfectly, or I don't give enough. I'm not precise enough in making sure that that point is made. The dream work is incomplete always. The good side of that is that it allows for the questioning to go on, as Francesca also mentioned. I'll get to her point in a minute. But it is also, but insofar as it takes place, insofar as it happens, it produces subjects, and it produces subjects that are not unified necessarily, and it produces subjects that might be privileged over others that are not, and in fact might even create certain kinds of conflicts, internal conflicts, which it often does. It creates, after all, let's not forget, the very notion of minority is a notion that emerges with a nation form. Minorities don't exist in pre-national formations, in empires. There's no such thing. So I'm going very quickly because I'm fortunate, because I want to hear more questions. So please pardon me for that. The question, Edward's point, and I should say also for the record that Edward Mitchell and I have been in conversation for decades, and in many ways this book was a part of our conversation, for which I will always be indebted to him. I would say that as Edward, you know very well, social fantasy is part of all societies. It's part of human societies, regardless, since they appeared on the planet as societies, whenever that would be. So it's not, and that cannot not be. There can be no societies that have no fantasy, that have no imaginary structures, imaginary desires. So the social fantasy of modernity may in fact be, a big part of it may in fact be this kind of categorization, this kind of obsession with classification. Foucault, after all, gives us that perfectly. And there is no doubt, at least for me, that the nation is a form of modernity. I mean, I don't buy the idea of the nations that existed that are equivalent to tribes or to races, as some people still do. It's a kind of a silly 19th century notion. So the nation is a form of modernity, and in that sense, specifically, one might say it does modernity's work. I would not say, though, that it's subservient. I would not introduce a hierarchy there, because there's a certain kind of coexistence, certain kind of coincidence, as I use the term in the book too. And to the degree that modernity still goes on, it's a project that has not, that's ongoing. It's not finished, despite this business about postmodernity. The nation, quite obviously, is ongoing. So again, very quickly, Francesca, I mean, there's one thing I would say that you also know, I'm sure, is that the patriarchal fantasy is essential to the nation. I mean, there is no nationalism without the patriarchal fantasy, whose premier iteration is, of course, the family. Dimitris has written a brilliant book on this matter, and that includes protection. I mean, that's part of the patriarchal fantasy. Protection and oppression go together, and in that sense, the nightmare business comes right back in, because to the degree that the national fantasy must remain coveted as sort of this extraordinary valuable metaphysics, that unassailable metaphysics, the essence of a people and all that business, then there will always be a protection of the limits of who would be part of that essence and the terms in which one would be included. So there's not only that some people would be excluded, but how they would be included has to happen in certain terms. And any kind of anti-nationalist position, I will say this is a blanket statement, would also have to be a kind of feminist position or an anti-patriarchal position, which is broader than simply feminist. So that's my response to that point. Thank you. Pardon me for the brevity, okay?
But this is part of the game. One of the reasons we have put this a network together is to show community, because we are communities of scholars, and we read together, we exchange ideas. Part of the game I have, as a chair, allowed now is to have groups of questions, even if they're not similar. But do take this. I mean, one of the aims of the network is to share texts, and we have shared these texts quite a lot. Could I ask Eleftheria Ioannidou to go next? Eleftheria, if, yeah.
Thank you very much, Dimitris and Maria, for organizing this. Thank you very much, Stathis, for a thought-provoking presentation once again. So I think I speak for more people when I say that this book has defined the way we have come to study Greece from our respective fields: modern Greek studies, cultural studies, theater studies, classical reception. It has prompted us as scholars to think above and beyond disciplinary boundaries. Its analysis traverses not only the nation as a socio-imaginary form, but also the hierarchies of knowledge that institute it as a political project. And this I take to be the reason the book was embraced by post-colonial scholarship and Greek studies engaging with culturalist or materialist critique, whilst it was more provocative for a strand of modern Greek studies that maintained the focus on the study of texts. Now, at some point in the book, Stathis, you're referring to Zizek's argument that the nation exists as long as its enjoyment continues to be materialized in social practices. Now, the celebrations we're about to revel in, or not, could be seen as one such practice. The performances of Greek drama, where my own interest lies, have been a formidable mechanism of preserving that jouissance. But here comes my question, though, and it is inspired by the book's autoscopic nature, this self-reflective writing. Is the subversion of hegemonic narratives an epistemological practice that prolongs the enjoyment of the nation as well? And as we partake in the nation's dream work, is our enjoyment bound to be ultimately defined by what it opposes?
That's a good question.
Thank you, Eleftheria. Theatrical as you were, you took me there. You finished abruptly. So could I also ask, could I ask Eleni Papargiriou to go next, and then Aris Kaladidis? Well, yeah.
Thank you so much, and this is very enjoyable. The community spirit is definitely present. Stathis, I would like to ask you, I reread your introduction. I didn't have the time to read the whole thing again, but it struck me how literal your notion of dreaming is, which is not self-evident. The fact that you're talking about psychoanalytical dreams and you're using Freudian sort of psychoanalytical tools to discuss that. And there are many instances where you discuss ways of seeing, technologies of seeing, macroscopic views or microscopic views, the spectral and the spectacular at the same time, which I find very interesting. And I was wondering, 25 years on, as the paradigm of media has changed, how do you see this kind of technologies of seeing, like dreaming as seeing and all that, in the digital revolution age?
And from dreaming and the technologies of dreaming, now in the digital age, to geography. Ari, you are next.
Thanks very much. Thanks for this introduction. What I would like to add, and it's more of a comment than actually a question, is I would like to, let's say, add an angle to it, and that would be looking at it from the viewpoint of human geography, and think of how your book and your work resonates with geographical thought. And this, could be interesting to think about that. One of the basic concepts that we use in geography is that of borders and boundaries. With borders, we tend to think of territorial borders. With boundaries, we tend to think of other types of lines of division, of inclusion and exclusion. And what is so interesting in the formation of the nation is also the formation of the nation state, where you have, in a sense, a clash of territorial borders and sort of social constructed boundaries on the other side, where the nation is defined in a certain group, in a certain way, and also by an imaginary, whereas the state has a territorial dimension and territorial borders. And these two things not only don't coincide, but they actually clash. In the formation of the nation, you have, first of all, internal exclusions. So inside the territories of the state, you have certain groups that are excluded either completely in the nation formation on the territory, but then you may have a national imaginary that creates a nation that goes beyond the borders of the actual territorial state, right? So on the one hand, you have an exclusion inside the territory, which creates a homogeneity, and let's say more of a homogeneous imaginary than real homogeneity. And then you have an inclusion of a nation much, much broader than the actual territorial limits that creates an imaginary of grandeur, right? Which is done very, very often, and it's used, from literature, using, all the Eastern Mediterranean or as a kind of a Greek Hellenistic imaginary, all the way to the Greek diaspora today, that creates almost a jus sanguinis of what is to be a Greek. And there are certain groups that are, have been excluded internally. I mean, the way that, Tsamides or even the Greek Jews become or not become a part of the nation building. And the way that Nar shows very well how that happened in Salonika, how, Jews came to a point where historically they had to leave a multinational Ottoman Empire and decide whether they will be part of this new nation that is co-defined by religion, and that way create their own exclusion. And I think this is very interesting to think about what that means for us today. So in coming to the end, and maybe a question for you. If we think of all the groups that are then actually included, and Jews in the way are included in this nation building as Greek Jews, but with limits. So even the way that certain groups are included in this nation building is with a limited type of citizenship. There are certain things that are banned, such as the Macedonian language. There are certain things, there are certain habits that are banned, some religious practices. You start having, what should I call it, communitarian citizenship forms. So you have particular rights for the Muslim community. Jews are excluded from primary education, teaching, and so on. And all these sort of, it's not just that some groups become subjects of this new nation, but they become subject with very different rights. So their level of citizenship, the type of citizenship is very unequal. And this is challenged again today. So how do refugee movements, and I'm talking Greek refugee movements, but also current refugee movements, and transport migration completely reconfigures the question of what it is to be a Greek, and in a sense, what it is to be a Greek citizen. And to come back to what was said earlier, the feminist movement, the LGBTQ movement today, are movements that actually question how you're included or not included as an equal citizen inside the nation. And I won't go to that today, but there was a huge discussion in Greece yesterday, actually, about somebody replacing the famous, symbol of the Greek Yelavra with a rainbow flag. But I'll end here and just ask that.
Okay, so these things are actually interrelated. Eleftheria's and Lenin's questions are in some ways touched very much on a similar thing if we think of theatricality as in a kind of mediatic way. I would say, hold on just a second. And I think they are linked to Ari, your question, which is it has other elements, but the element of the oppositional or the anti-national. So there's no doubt, I think, that while the national fantasy will continue to institute and to enact practices of celebration of itself, as sort of narcissistic enjoyment, use kind of that kind of language. There is no doubt that in the world of today, compared to what it was 25 years ago, the media level, the mediatic, the medium that is created by technology that brings people together is so different in scale. I mean, you all know this. I'm not saying something that you don't know. So we have a certain kind of acceleration, and a certain kind of acceleration that actually becomes dangerous to the national fantasy, because and facilitates, one might say, anti-national, antithetical elements. So much so that the attempt by the narcissistic attempt for not fully working or ending up in kinds of situations that many of us can recognize as being kitsch or sort of ridiculous. Of course, this means that the society is divided even further, because there are those who actually enjoy the narcissism and they truly give into it with extraordinary pleasure and revel in the fantasy, because that is precisely what keeps it's a safeguard. It keeps them safe from the fact that in today's global world, sort of mediatic global world, the limits are way more porous, and that there is really great difficulty in controlling the national fantasy. So, I mean, this is linked, Ari, to your point, which is the essence of your point. But let me just say something about the Jewish question. This is not a Greek issue, okay? It's as you know, right? It is an entirely European issue. It is part of the national formation in every European country, in some form or other. I suggest, and it is very much linked to the colonial project. That's actually the most important thing. I know that religion is the language and the semiotics of the thing, but I invite you to think of it beyond the matter of religious difference. I suggest the great book on this matter is this book by Amir Mufti called "Enlightenment in the Colony," in which he is discussing the India-Pakistan partition situation entirely in terms of the national fantasy problem, but the source for this discussion is his account of the Jewish question in Germany in the 19th century, and he shows that he shows in ways that are truly remarkable that the Jewish question in Germany is already inheres aspects of it is already part of colonial practice. So the inside-outside thing, in that sense, becomes blurred much more than we think. Although we all know there's the issues of internal exclusion and, of course, clearly a kind of external difference, which is the adversarial relationship with the other on the other side of the border. Now, this is why the nation state, as a concept, is inadequate to account for what I was trying to do, and I'm still, and even today, I still think, and I point this out in the book because the national fantasy always exceeds the boundaries that are determined to be, the borders that are determined to be the borders of that state. The fantasy, as we know, is always excessive, it's always surplus. There's always desire for more. And the idea of discovering lands and places where our people once lived or had rights to. So that is, of course, not also again a Greek question. The matter now is not just simply geographical, but to bind sort of, or to think of the 3 points together, it is a matter of a certain kind of technologies, and I would call them technologies of capital, because media is really part of the technologies of capital. And here, the globalized world, which is of course the world of capital, is, and this is the contradiction here, is in fact one of the areas where resistance to nationalism is most found, and the antidote to nationalism exists. So I understand, what I'm saying and how, people would say, but are you in favor of global capital? I'm not in favor of global capital per se, although I think it's kind of silly to say whether one's favor or against it, because the against being of global capital, as we see, leads us back to a certain kind of nationalist retrenchment. We have not seen any kind of paradigm of resistance to global capital that isn't nationalist in some fashion. And what has been lost in this discussion is the internationalist element, which had Marxist origins in the 19th century, but was the key to anti-colonial independence movements throughout the 20th. And that aspect, the kind of universal globality that anti-colonial thinkers were thinking, is a kind of alternate view of the global. And that is where, for me, the main thrust of opposition to nationalism is. So, the refugee phenomenon, which is, again, not just a matter of capital, but of the legacy of colonialism / imperialism, is just another, another semiotic field of a problem that seems to be inherent in national formation. And that leads us to the question of citizenship, about which I can say a lot, but I'm not going to, because I want to hear other questions. And if somebody wants to bring in the question of citizenship in some fashion in terms of their interests, then we can do it that way. Okay?
I will make sure I will bring in again if it hasn't been fully addressed, especially with the new technologies, as Aris and Eleni mentioned. But let me go, as you mentioned capital, you almost mentioned debt. Let's go to Johanna Hanik. Johanna, your comment.
Thank you. I just want to echo the thanks that everybody has given so far. Picking up on this theme of the global, Stathi, I'd be really curious to hear your thoughts about a relatively recent development, which really sort of gained some traction or started at least under Syriza, which was Greece's partnership with China, and the way that is discursively framed as it's a sort of archaeo-diplomatic rhetoric, where this is sort of the representatives of, so the most ancient civilization of the West meets the most ancient civilization of the East, and therefore these two nations are uniquely positioned to not only to sort of understand each other, but also to engage in economic development, especially around the Belt and Road project. And so I was just wondering to hear about how you see that kind of Greece is looking to partners that are sort of principled on this notion that they're rooted, nation states rooted in ancient civilizations, but they're spread across the world as a way of kind of circumventing Europe nowadays. I'd be curious to hear your reflections on that. So thank you.
And let's go to Yorgos Douliakas.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
So, hi, Stathis. My question ties a bit with what Eleftheria mentioned earlier. It's about, for example, how can we disturb the nation's dream work? And should we want to do such a thing? I mean, Dimitris has spoken elsewhere of archive trouble, and I'm wondering what would the implications of troubling the nation's cultural archive be, or the national archive, if you want. And you mentioned a bit Edward Said so far, and I was wondering what forms of resistance or critiques of modes of commemorations, such as the ones we see these days, fit into your
understanding of secular criticism.
Okay, and the last part of this group, Nicolas Kakufa, will go next. I will have to say, we have a lot of questions on YouTube, and I will ask them immediately after. So please keep writing your questions on the YouTube link. We are not putting them aside. It's just that we had these 8-10 questions coming in first from the Zoom. So Nicola, you're next, then Stathis, and then I will somehow summarize what we're getting from the YouTube link as well. Nicola.
Thank you, Dimitri. Thank you, Maria. Thank you, Christina. Thank you, Stathis. I was thinking about this book a lot because I was reading the chapter on Gourgouris recently for another project. And I realized that what you imagined in this book, Stathi, by the time it became available to me to read, it has birthed its own body. So what you imagined, it became a body of work. And I was very struck again by the two quotes that you have at the beginning of the book about Blanchot and the echo of what cannot see speaking in connection to this, to praxis as a perpetually transformed relation to the object by Castoriadis. I cannot distinguish echo from narcissism because of it, because of how those two are connected. And I was thinking a lot about this notion of the body and how it is needed to imagine or to act or to speak, but at the same time is not present necessarily, or it is imagined as such. And in your chapter on Gourgouris, especially about natural history and national pedagogy, you use a lot of somatic language. You talk about the body of language, you talk about illness, understanding language as illness, the nation as illness. So my question, I guess, has to do with, okay, one minor point. I'm haunted by how Gourgouris was looking at Voltaire's translation of relics and how that created his own imagination of Greece, of that dead body being around, and then how Greece itself with Solomos and Palamas becoming again this dead body that appears and creates stuff. And then what's happening right now with the celebration, right? How these corpses are being carried around as a celebration of something that could be considered dead. Philosophy, you say in this book, is how we treat this illness, right? If you can connect this notion of the body, the presence and not presence of the body and its necessity, and how we imagine this as a field of modern Greek studies, trying to participate and exist in an international discourse now. And thanks.
Do you start?
All right. These are different things. Let's see. I mean, the issue, the relation with China is the Chinese are really taken with Greece as an ancient civilization, and for them, they don't have the baggage that comes, that the Europeans bring to this business. Because they don't need it. They have their own ancient civilization. They don't need to borrow someone else's. So in that respect, they are, their sensibility is actually quite acute. I will give you a very quick anecdote because it's really important. It's kind of funny actually, but it's an important thing. The modern Greek studies programs in China are incredibly successful, and they have huge numbers. So when I know this from one of the Syriza ministers, when the Syriza government first went to China, this question was asked. How come and so on? These Chinese students speak perfect Greek and all that, and their answer, apart from it's sort of in addition to the great civilizations that we share. Was that Greece was the only country that when China, after the Chinese Revolution, was successful, the only country that, though did not have diplomatic relations, did not hold to the embargo. As the history of Greece and its naval, its trade capacity to break embargoes. That's a very long history, a very interesting one too. So the Chinese were particularly taken by who are these people who are in fact kind of being maverick in this relationship, and they wanted to find out more about it and how they they wanted to start, classes of the Greek language and eventually set up modern Greek programs. And they sent some of their people to Albania, because that was the country with which they had relations, and learned their Greek from the Greek population, Greek-speaking population in Albania. Now, I think that is such an unusual and strange fact, a historical thing, that I think also plays a role in this particular relation. The main reason of which, of course, for this relation is, of course, economic, and it's part of alternative relations to what is, in fact, a credible global power. So the question about your question about secular criticism, that I don't know. It's interesting, there are elements of that already in that book, but I wasn't aware of them. I mean, I wasn't aware that I was going to go there quite. I was always concerned with, I'm a materialist, so I was always concerned with religious metaphysics as a problem in society. I considered it a problem in society. So, and certainly the peculiar relation of Greek nationalism to the church, which is not true of all nationalisms, is really something that we cannot get around. And that in that sense, one might say that secular criticism is profoundly anti-nationalist. And it was in Said's mind. I mean, because it's his term, he invented this term as a practice, right? Not as a theory. That very much of what he does under the name of secular criticism, which is something that pertains to the reading of literature, reading texts, is profoundly anti-nationalist, and it was always that way. And as he does later in his last book, it is humanist, anti-colonial humanist, by the way, not European humanist, and what he says, democratic criticism. He changes secular criticism to democratic criticism. So in that respect, my later work is connected to Dream Nation, along with various other things, the concept of myth and so on. Now, Nicola, I thank you really for speaking about Gourgouris, because I'm very proud of that of that text, actually, that particular chapter, and nobody talks about it. And because at the time, no one really outside of Greece had written anything about Gourgouris at all, because the texts are not translated and so on and so forth. I should say that all of those metaphors about the body, or the pharmacology and illness and all that, are really his own. I'm not imposing my own language here. I'm really literally drawing from his language. And it's not surprising considering where he came from. I mean, intellectually, and what he was part of a certain kind of anthropology. I say anthropology, not in terms of anthropology departments of today, but in a grand old sense of the 18th century, from a certain kind of anthropological understanding of society, which has certain notions of the body, not the body politic as it became known, but a certain kind of organic aspects, which are not antithetical to my arguments about the psyche and the psychosocial, right? There's no divergence there, although he was a hardcore Enlightenment person, a materialist in the best sense. And for him, language was material entirely, not an epiphenomenon, but something something in which one could see historical creation, a certain kind of technology. We can say that too. So the thing about the dead, is, Foucault here is the person who taught us that very well, that philology was really very close to anatomy. Literally, again, in its invention as a practice in the 19th century, and it was an anatomical practice. The body in this case was not an actual body of humans, but culture as a body. And in order to conduct the anatomy of a society or a culture, you have to kill it. Ernest Renan talks about vivisection, actually, That's the term he uses. So, you actually carve people while they're alive, in the process killing them. So I want us to come back now on the basis of this to the beginning of the points I made about Orientalism. Orientalism really was a science. First of all, by the way, it was an academic discipline, right? Orientalists were quite capable in what they did in terms of their languages they knew, and they knew them very well. Said again tells us that they weren't cracks. But Orientalism, in order to achieve its object of knowledge, it actually has to kill it. And it kills the societies that it examines. It pronounces them dead and ancient. And this was the attitude towards the modern Greeks. They don't really exist, because in a strange way, you kind of create a kind of resurrection. Okay, it's again the time of year, the resurrection of the ancients, and while you in fact kill the moderns. As for the epigraphs, I have to say one thing only: they're not in reference at all to content. They pertain to writing. They're reflections upon writing, the process of writing, the praxis of writing, not so much the content of this book. Thank you.
Stathi, there are so many questions and so interesting questions. I will be trying to summarize now questions that I've been receiving either from Zoom or on YouTube. Let me say that we decided to do this in parallel, especially because it was oversubscribed. We do apologize to people who had to stay on the YouTube, but please type in your questions. So I will be reading a couple, 2 or 3 questions from the YouTube, and then please respond briefly. And then once again, because there are many. So one group of questions on the live YouTube link have to do with the way that the nation can be positive or negative in a sense. Maria is asking, are there any alternatives to the nation, considering shifting global aspects ranging from the digital revolution, social unrest, global economic and military crisis? Or are we talking about a need to ameliorate, to improve the nation in a sense? So can we escape the nation as a formation? Can we improve it? Can we find a different way to think it? Then another question, actually a series of questions has to do, relate to this issue of the patriarchal nation. So Tonia Kazakopoulou asks, if the nation is always patriarchal, right? And if patriarchal fantasy is essential to the nation, as you mentioned, is the dream work itself gendered at the originary level of nation formation, privileging from the outset white and male as categories? Is the social imaginary, therefore, of the nation, is the social imaginary that's instigated by the nation always then exclusively male and masculine? And that relates also to a beautiful question by Natasha Rem from Ireland. Could you see Greek history then, its span, as an awareness of intersectional forms of oppression, gender, race, sexualities, class, nurturing patriarchal national fantasies, indeed our archive of fixations?
Okay, sorry, I was looking also at the YouTube questions for a second to see, and there's some questions about the colonial issues that I want to talk to about.
Why were you looking at other questions?
No, I was just curious.
You see now?
Because I was listening.
I'm joking. I can, of course, repeat.
I will answer the questions you posed, of course. To my mind, of course, the dream work is gendered. I mean, it cannot but be gendered insofar as we, the imagination of humans is gendered still, perhaps, or I don't know. And there's no doubt in my mind that the nation's patriarchal. And that's that does not necessarily mean that it won't, that within a nation, there cannot be, let's just say, the emancipation of women. Obviously we have the history of enfranchisement of women, of the right to vote and so on, in the process of a national dream work, being, running. But that doesn't, as we all know, and again, we don't need to elaborate, that does not mean either that the dream work is not gendered, or that the nation is not patriarchal. So, by the way, the same exact thing goes with issues of race, and there is no doubt that the racial components of the nation as a form are always prominent, and so far they have not been overcome, not in the least. Regardless of what might have been the struggles within a society, for emancipation, et cetera, et cetera. So, can the nation be improved? Boy, I don't even know how to answer that. I'm profoundly anti-nationalist, as you can tell. So I don't think.
But very pro-dream nation.
Sorry?
Profoundly anti-nationalist, but very pro-dream nation somehow.
Well, no. I mean, the dream issue, Dimitri, is really a kind of method. Again, let's not kind of fetishize it. It's really a way of reading and understanding, the formation of identities beyond the typical ways that this is usually studied. And as Olga, I think it was Olga, right, that brought up the issue of the nightmare, which I think is a great thing to have put in there. There's nothing neutral about the dream or the dream work. It never is neutral. I don't know what a national identity without nationalism means. I don't quite know whether that's possible. I understand that nationalism might have degrees of iteration, from an obvious, explicit, self narcissistic sort of one to a tacit, controlled, perhaps romantic, et cetera, I mean, in some kind of range. I can understand that. But I don't think that nations can continue to exist without nationalist sentiment at some level. And nationalist sentiment has to be strong enough to be able to hold together what otherwise are constant contradictions and tensions between people in a society that could, in fact, ultimately lead to society falling apart. Because the nation as a form occurs in a very specific point in the history of social imagination, it has certain aspects, I think, that are sort of at this point admaneuverable. One of which is patriarchal, the other of which is a certain kind of narcissism, and so on and so forth. So I don't know if the nation can be improved. Yes, one can say can be improved in the same way that we can say certain reforms can improve certain institutions. I'm not knocking that at all. But can it really become an emancipatory form? I don't think so. Now, this brings us to a question that I think is very, very important, the question of national independence, which links to some of the questions about decolonization that some people have asked on YouTube. No one could, in their right mind, could say that national independence movements are wrong, or that people should not fight for the right to self-determination. That would be a fascist thing to say if one were to deny that. So, period. However, the history of national independence movements shows, that includes Greece, but Greece is just a minor example in the sea of examples, before and after. The history of national independence movements shows that once nations are formed and states cement them in a certain kind of reproduction, which would take us back to this discussion about school books and all that, that at that point, self-determination becomes a ruse. And societies are subjugated to a creation of their own, to a creature of their own making. And so only a certain kind of, sorry to put it in those terms again, global or international, but I mean international the way Fanon thinks of it, okay? That's for me, the beacon of when we think of the international. A certain kind of other universal, a notion of the human, only that could be the alternative to what ultimately is a subjugation of subjectivities under a specific, under the power of national identity forms. Does this make sense? So this is a very complicated matter, and I don't think that we have to be open to always looking at the specifics, as I said before. But if I can make such a general statement as I made, I would put it in those terms.
There will be more questions. We are coming close to the end of the discussion. So if anyone wants to type their questions, please do so. Now, while you were speaking, Stathis, I was thinking, yes, okay, but today, going back to these new technologies we've been talking, there may be ways to think of national identity more as assemblage, in the way that now we are more prone to thinking of archives as assemblage, of the viewed, of the dream viewed as an assemblage that we constantly remake. There may be other ways to think, other ways that would be less patriarchal. And that is my comment. The fact that we cannot necessarily think about it in those terms now, but we can think about how assemblage identities come in our everyday, may not be enough to say that it will not come to then affect the national. In any case, I wanted to go back, and in order to give to give to all questions, there was a question that pushes us back to the first reception of the book. I remember people being so angry or shocked that you mentioned colonialism in your title, in your discussions. I mean, what on earth did Greece have to do with the colonial project? There are a couple of questions dealing with this, wanting you to elaborate a little bit on that. But there is also a very interesting question by Panos Lagopoulos that says, could you also say that 19th century produced, in a sense, Greece as the closest version of white, if I understand well the question, while India was the non-white Orient? Could it be that a certain sense of European racism was very much related to the Philhellenic sentiment, if I understand the question right? There are, of course, other questions that you pretty much tackled about the kind of idea of the decolonizing moment and the flexibility of the term the term nation. And yeah, and I have to also say that there are many comments saying how pertinent your book has been, and how important rereading it now. I quote here Athena Athanasiou, who has just typed in a comment, thank you for the exciting rereading of your book. It really seems to be the more important to be reading and discussing such writing at this time. So many people related to this event are thinking about the now. Your brief comment, and then we have 3 questions from the Zoom panel to take this to a close.
Okay, yes, I think to briefly, right, in kind of telegraphic form, yes, Philhellenism involves racism. It has to. It does inevitably because it is driven by a sense of self-identity of the Europeans that is linked to the ancient ideal, and that what though the Philhellenes contributed to the war of national independence, about which this cannot be disputed, their motivation was ultimately self-serving, and it was self-serving, to begin with. It's not even something that's necessarily conscious, because it is, because the ancient Greeks were considered to be white, while these contemporary ones were basically Ottomans. I mean, they the difference just wasn't, they were illiterate peasants and so on and so forth. So they dressed in a very funny way. They didn't wear Frankish clothing, fragica, as we say. So I think there's no doubt about that. So the issue, I understand that the issue of colonization was controversial. It created a lot of misreadings. People thought that I was talking about the Ottomans as the colonial power over the Greeks, which of course it was the furthest from my mind, because that assumption is a nationalist assumption. It actually claims, by saying so, that Greece existed before, that there was a nation that the Ottomans, colonized. And that's not the case. Greeks existed, but not in this form. So it's a kind of a retroactive concept. But the colonization argument is important, as I said before, and the Philhellenism study is important, as I said before, because it gets us to understand that 1821 and all that stuff, and the institution of modern Greece, it was, part of a broader network of formations that are essential to the world that we are in today, and that it was at the heart of the colonial project that was being conducted in that era. And the one more thing about in relation to your own comment, I'm open, very much open to your suggestion. I'm open-minded about that. I'm the only thing I would say, the parallel for me is whether, for example, they can, the issue of democracy is an issue for me, right? I mean, we can create anarchist assemblages, but can we really figure out how to create a different kind of society under these specific presence of the state, the way that it is today? Similarly, yes, subjectivities can create all kinds of emancipating both assemblages, racial, gender, sexuality, and so on, but citizenship issues and so on. But is it possible for that to overcome, to undo, the hegemony of national identity? I don't know. So let's leave it open. I'm open to it. But
we have the three final questions from panelists here. This has been amazing, really amazing. So could I ask Vasiliki Kolokotroni to go next for her comment or question, then Claudio Russello? Yes, Vasiliki.
Hello, Stathi. Hello all. Thank you so much for this opportunity to revisit this formidable book, which actually couldn't be more timely for me because I was going to go back to your book anyway, because I'm working on something just now. It's early days that involves, the going back to Philhellenism. Though I've found a little interesting corner, which has raised some interesting questions, which tally with very much what you've been talking about, which is to do with how do you work around the, as you say, the dark underside of Philhellenism, the construction of Hellenist, exceptionalism and so on and so forth, and of course the issues of nationalism. But I'm wondering, and this is fairly, it's a kind of a genuine question just now. I mean, you spoke about internationalism, which really would be my default, would be my, red card, raised against all of those discourses. But then reading into the, if you want, ultimately a kind of co-creation of a discourse of Scottish nationalism and with anti-colonial, if you can call them that, inflections against English hegemony or the Anglo-Scottish hegemony of the time. Okay, I see there the creation of not so much a Greek exceptionalism, through this whole kind of ideology of the glory that was Greece and the bulwark against the Ottoman barbarian, all that, but the discourse of exemplarity. Mm-hmm. I mean, I'm not going to call it solidarity because there was that element too, but there's definitely a discourse of exemplarity to do with which has. So, I mean, it involves some very interesting work of translation and mediation, which has its very funny elements, as any translation element has its, has a lot of scope for comedy and farce. There's a lot of kind of mistranslation back and forth of, kind of Byronic Greece and then folk Greece back into, the romance of the Highlanders and the clan system as opposed to the, imposed by the English, aristocracy sort of system and all that. But even if you, even if you don't break it down to that kind of level of detail, could we make a broader point and allow nationalism or nationalisms to have a kind of innocent moment, that early moment of mediation, a dialogical moment where certain nationalisms as emergent formations out of a discourse of, let's say, domination, a kind of a self-identification with a whole, set of contingents. Because I mean, as you will know, I mean, in the early, in the American Philhellenic press, there were, there was a lot of slippage between what was happening in Greece and the slavery, the abolitionist movement, yes, and Mexico and Venezuela. So that kind of resonance, which is horizontal at any given moment in time. I mean, can we sort of
recoup that vision? Can we return to those visions? Right?
No, yeah. I mean, there's the issue of the kind of the Badiouian sort of loyalty to the event, which is one way of putting it. But I don't even want to be that kind of.
We are running out of time.
About it. It's about the, as I said, for me, translation alongside your wonderful work on the dream, the work of translation, that kind of dialogical kind of mediation. Could that be, I mean, I know that you can't isolate it because then it becomes other things once you have the state formation and you have the apparatuses and the intelligentsia and all that. But could we, hold on to a moment and kind of make something of it,
We are running out of time. So the last two questions, Claudio Russello is next.
Yes, hello. Thank you very much, Dimitri and Stathis for this amazing conversation we're having today. I'll try to keep it as short as possible. My question, I mean, I would like to go back for a second to the present occasion of the bicentenary, celebrations, for the celebration of the bicentenary of the Greek War of Independence, and how Greece is celebrating it right now. And I was thinking of the video that was circulated, set in the Panathinaikos Stadium. I mean, Dimitris has talked about this in Καθημερινή, and Dimitris Pantos as well has contributed with an amazing piece about it. And I was thinking, how can the national dream work be redreamed, if at all? How can it be reimagined? Reading the criticism that this video got, it's because, I mean, it's all white in a sense. It's set in this in the archaeological space. So how can we incorporate? How can different voices and different perspectives be incorporated again in the national dream work? And I'll keep it here. Thank you so much.
And Jeroen Nicolaou will ask the last question, bringing Cyprus also in the frame.
Hi, yes, thank you so much. So you spoke about the excesses of nationalism, that the insatiable or inexorable desires of nationalism. And I can't help but think that these are also linked to the national DreamWorks death drive, because we are talking about dreams after all. And I bring this up because you mentioned the case of Cyprus, because the idea of nightmare came up. And I believe that Cyprus especially is paradigmatic of that kind of death drive in terms of how a big part of its society embraces Greek nationalism and the kind of Greek nationalism that it embraces, and how it does it in this peculiar position from outside of the Greek nation itself. And I'm particularly thinking about recent developments with regards to the Cyprus problem and different alliances within the Eastern Mediterranean that really have modulated and challenged some of the nationalist narratives that Greek Cypriots have been living by up to now. So my question is, does nationalism ever confront its self-destructive nature, or does it always sort of transubstantiate it into some sort of future ideal, turning it into a part of its narcissistic identity, what we discuss as its narcissistic identity, and into this forward-looking narrative that anticipates a historical narrative? And is this part of the nation as genre, what you mentioned in the beginning? Thank you.
Add to that a comment by Olga Dimitriou, and Greece becoming a colonial power vis-a-vis Cyprus. Your last point, Stathi, before we also present finally, and before we take this full event to a close, our new website, our new platform. So your last comments to these questions. So
yes, well, I'll start with that. You know, I think the nationalism death drive is just always there. The question is, does it get fully enacted? One might say, well, you know, the most famous example of nationalism's death drive, of course, is Nazi Germany. I mean, that's a classic case of a nation, you know, killing itself, committing suicide on account of its fantasy. You know, but it doesn't have, you know, one might say the Megali Idea is a kind of instance of a death drive. You know, the question is I don't know, the death drive is obviously not something one controls if we're thinking Freudian terms, but here I have to say, I'm at fault, of course, because I brought this stuff up. There are certain limits to the Freudian paradigm in relation to matters of society. I'm always aware of that, even though I'm interested in a certain method, as I said, to think through things, because we can't just make, you know, an obvious sort of simple transfer. I think your question is linked to the other ones from the reverse end. I mean, Vasiliki, you know, the innocent moment is, you know, the innocent moment is the moment of beginning. It's the desire for an action towards self-determination. It's the point at which a national independence movement is, of course, created. And I don't think there's a way to return to that except in these kinds of secondary elaborations, which are the celebrations and all that, and it just sort of becomes part of memory, but it's no longer innocent. And one might say the question of defense. What does one do when one's nation is literally you know, threatened by an act of conquest by another? One might say that in that act of resistance, a certain of that original innocence might return. That's an interesting question. But the innocent moment, as like all innocent moments, are quickly lost, you know, after they happen. So this leads me to Claudio's point. Can the dream work be reimagined? Of course. the point is to avoid simple reproduction, or the question rather is how to avoid reproduction, how to avoid the repetition of the same, that is part of the question, as many of you have posed already, in many ways pushing my my view to think of alternative possibilities or openings within the national formation. And as I said before, in relation to Dimitri's point, I'm open-minded in relation to that. But I do not have an affirmative statement. I would only put it in terms of question. So it's not so much whether the dream work can be reimagined, because the dream work is reimagined. The question is, what is that reimagining? Can that reimagining break the process of reproduction of the nation, reproduction of the national identity, and all that comes with it? So that, of course, is a key question that needs to be asked in all cases, not just in the Greek case. Thank you.
Well, we cannot reimagine the nation, as we have heard today. By the way, Stathi, we will thank you in the end, but it was amazing, and amazing panelists, and the richness of this answers many questions raised often, why we do such work in the way we do it. And as we say in Greek, όποιος κατάλαβε, κατάλαβε. Now, we try to reimagine, if not the nation, at least national studies here and modern Greek studies. And one way to do that has been to try to frame and reframe our output. We have been working in the last year through TORCH, the Oxford Research Centre in the Humanities, with the amazing help of Anbara Khalidi, who is also here with us, and everyone at TORCH who has been supportive. But at the same time, we have been given a special grant by the MGSA, the Modern Greek Studies Association in America, to develop a new website. And this is what Christina Gidgaudaite will present to us now. This will be our new platform, and we thought it was only, it was kind of a nice moment to do this. This is a week of national celebration. Well, for us, this is a week we answer in this way. So I'm giving this now, microphone now to Christina, who will present the website. And from me, a great thank you. Eventually, Christina, I will thank you all and you, Stathis. But for the moment, the presentation of the website, Greek Studies Now.
So hello, everybody, as well from me. Before I move on to the website, let me just also thank very much for this amazing conversation that we've been having here for the past 2 hours. Thank you, Stathi, for the book that you wrote and for the book, the work that this book continues doing. And thank you, everybody, also for contributing with such amazing comments and insights that not only rethink this specific moment in time in Greece, but also bring Greece in dialogue with other global questions, very much in the spirit of the network that we've been trying to encourage with the events that we've been holding for the past year. And as Dimitris has said, one of these initiatives has been to launch our new website. It's been on our minds from the very beginning of this network a year ago now. But it could be realized thanks to the Modern Greek Studies Association Innovative Initiatives grant. And with the help of Periklis Duvitsas, who designed this website for us. And since we have him with us today as well, I would like to start by just giving him a few words.
Thank you, Christina. First, congratulations to you all for this great event tonight. I'm very honored to have designed the logo and the website for such a great project. And the fact that my platform is also hosting this website makes me very optimistic. I sense that it can be a great tool to bring modern Greek studies and culture in touch with the world. In fact, for some time now, since I came back to Greece to work here, I miss this kind of bridge. I wish for a network like that a lot. Dimitris knew that when he asked me to discuss a dedicated website, so being part in this makes me very happy. So thank you, Dimitris, for this initial invitation. Thank you all, Maria, Christina, Yorgos, and Claudio, for making this happen.
Thank you, Pericles. Let me share my screen and delve now for a second with the website, into the website with you to show what we have been plotting. So this is our initial platform as once kind of imagined by Claudio Russello and then brought into virtual reality by Pericles Devitsas for us. Our address, Greek Studies Now, that you can see here. And then these are the main categories that we have designed. And by clicking on our logo, you can delve inside. And here you see some information about our network and how it started. If you would like to learn more, there's also an About section here as well. And then it hosts our events, as we have said, that we've been running in virtual form for the past year, but also you can find some information, for example, about the very first conference which launched that network as a Torch International partnership in January last year. We have also have excellent blog with many contributions from diverse people from different backgrounds. Here you can see the piece that kind of outlines the logic and some ideas that were at the back of our minds when creating the network. And here, many of the blog contributions also in one way or the other touch on the questions that we've been dealing in this conversation as well, you know, history, national identities, gender, biopolitics are the issues that are also addressed in a number of different contributions that you can see here. We also have a section that hosts videos of our events, including the video of this event today, which will be hosted here, as you can see, but also of all our past events. And then there is a section that we've initiated with this website, which is called Book Self, which provides personal reflections on the journey of writing one or another book, coming from the scholars themselves, as well as interviews and personal book reviews as well. And what we hope to do with this website is really, let you wander around and explore by yourself. So when you come to one or other post, there's also a section that gives you some related posts that you can read. And then you can also keep reading. Keep reading or watch a video. So it's up to you really to explore and create your own itinerary as you navigate through the website. I also have to say that we also have a link to subscribe to our newspaper if you would like to join us. And we also welcome and extend the invitation for your own ideas if you have, if you would like to contribute in any way to the website as well. This is a brief presentation, and as the event finishes, we hope you will also take a time and explore the website. And just to finish, again, we would like to thank the MGSA Innovative Initiatives Fund for making it realize, for making us realize this website, for Pericles Dovitsas, for all his hard work, and putting all our ideas together and giving them this form, to Claudia Russello and to Yorgos Zuliakas, who also assisted with website editing as we've been collecting ideas together. We would also like to thank our supporters who have been with us for the past year, to Torch Network, who helped us to initiate this partnership a year ago and who has been with us on every occasion ever since. Also to the modern Greek departments at Oxford and at Amsterdam that have been providing support, as well as the Ekaterina Laskaridis Foundation. And also thank for everybody joining us today into this wonderful conversation. We hope that the conversations will continue.
Thank you all for being here. Thanks to Stathis Gourgouris from Columbia University. Just to reiterate that this is a platform. We aim to have as inclusive discussions as possible. We aim to include, as you saw happening today, colleagues from all levels and all moments of their career. We aim also to allow ourselves to express the ideas we have about certain issues, especially coming from the now, modern Greek studies now. Stathi, I don't know whether you want to sort of unmute yourself for a last goodbye, but if not, yes, you do. Yes.
Yes, I wasn't able to. All I want to say that I'm profoundly grateful to everyone, really, for your thoughts and your comments, and for this conversation. I'm very happy and I thank you, the organizers, all of you, for putting this together. It's a great thing, and the project is great. I'm happy to be part of it.
We're all very honored. Don't forget, every month from now on, we are having the second and the third part of our different celebration of the 200 years since the declaration of Greek independence. What Greece is next on the 21st of April. For those of you, for anyone rather, who thought Greek studies was not the most interesting of fields, well, do check this video again. Thank you very much.